In the autumn of 1942, a Polish doctor named Stefan Kowalski sat in his modest clinic in the occupied town of Rozwadów, staring at a vial that contained no medicine, no cure, no poison. It held something far more powerful, a lie so perfect that it would fool the most ruthless killing machine in human history. Within months, this single vial would transform a sleepy farming community into a graveyard that the SS refused to enter, creating an invisible fortress that would shelter 5,000 Jewish refugees right under the noses of the Nazi occupation. The Germans would mark the entire region with skull-and-crossbones warnings, quarantine it from the outside world, and order their soldiers to stay away at all costs. But here's what they didn't know. There was no epidemic. Not a single person was actually sick. The entire outbreak of typhus fever was manufactured, a medical illusion so convincing that it kept the gas chambers empty and the firing squads idle for nearly 2 years. How did a country doctor and a handful of conspirators pull off one of the most audacious acts of resistance in World War II? And why has this story remained buried for so long? Before the occupation hardened into total nightmare, Rozwadów was unremarkable in every way that mattered to history. The town sat in southeastern Poland, surrounded by wheat fields and forests, home to fewer than 5,000 permanent residents who worked the land, attended Mass at the Catholic Church every Sunday, and knew each generation of their neighbors by name. Dr. Stefan Kowalski had returned to his hometown after medical school in Warsaw, expecting a quiet career delivering babies and treating winter colds. His colleague, Dr. Marek Nowak, ran a practice in a neighboring village just 15 kilometers away, and together they served a rural population that trusted them completely. When Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939, the war seemed distant at first, something happening in cities with radio broadcasts and newspaper headlines. But by 1941, the occupation had metastasized into every corner of Polish life. The Nazis established ghettos in nearby cities, rounded up Jewish families from the countryside, and created a network of labor camps that swallowed entire communities overnight. The transformation happened gradually, then suddenly. German patrols became routine, checkpoints appeared on roads that had been open for centuries, the sound of truck convoys in the middle of the night became normal. Jewish families who had lived in Rozwadów for generations began disappearing, transported to places with names that would become synonymous with hell itself: Bełżec, Sobibór, Treblinka. The remaining Polish population watched in horror as their neighbors were loaded onto cattle cars, knowing that speaking out meant joining them. Dr. Kowalski treated the injuries of people who had been beaten for breaking curfew, set the broken bones of those who had resisted labor conscription, and listened to whispered stories of mass graves in the forests. The occupation had rules, brutal and simple: obey, work, inform, or die. Resistance seemed impossible against an enemy that controlled every road, every rail line, every source of food and medicine. But something unexpected began happening in the spring of 1942. Jewish refugees started arriving in the countryside around Rozwadów, not by the dozens but by the hundreds. These were people who had escaped from ghettos before the final liquidations, families who had fled the cities when the deportations began, individuals who had survived massacres and made it this far on foot with nothing but the clothes they wore. They hid in barns, in root cellars, in the attics of churches, and in the thick forests that the Germans rarely patrolled. The local Polish population faced an impossible choice: turn them away and condemn them to certain death, or shelter them and risk collective punishment that could mean the execution of entire villages. The penalty for hiding Jews was death, not just for the individual caught, but often for their entire family, and sometimes for their neighbors as well. The SS had made examples of villages that had shown mercy, burning them to the ground and lining up survivors for mass shootings. Father Jerzy Laskowski, the Catholic priest who had baptized most of the children in Rozwadów, stood in his church that spring and made a decision that would define the rest of his life. During a clandestine meeting with Dr. Kowalski and a handful of trusted community leaders, he declared that turning away refugees was unthinkable, that it violated everything their faith stood for, and that they would find a way to protect as many people as possible, regardless of the cost. Anna Wojcik, a nurse who had worked with Dr. Kowalski since before the war, volunteered to coordinate with the underground resistance network that was smuggling people out of the cities. Within weeks, the number of hidden refugees swelled past 1,000. Barns that should have held livestock now concealed families. Forest camps grew in the deep woods where German patrols rarely ventured. The entire community became complicit in an act of mass defiance, but everyone understood the mathematics of survival. It was only a matter of time before the SS discovered what was happening. That's when Dr. Stefan Kowalski remembered something from his medical training, a peculiar immunological phenomenon called the Weil-Felix reaction. He sat down with Dr. Marek Nowak in a storage room behind the clinic and explained an idea so dangerous and so brilliant that it seemed to come from a fever dream rather than rational thought. They would create a typhus epidemic that existed only on paper and in blood tests, a phantom plague that would terrify the Germans into quarantining the entire region. The SS feared typhus more than they feared armed resistance, because typhus didn't discriminate between conqueror and conquered, and it could decimate an army faster than any partisan ambush. If they could convince the occupation authorities that Rozwadów and the surrounding villages were infected with epidemic typhus, the Germans would cordon off the area, refuse to enter, and inadvertently create a safe zone for thousands of refugees. The plan required perfect execution, nerves of steel, and a willingness to bet everything on a medical deception that had never been attempted on this scale. Dr. Kowalski looked at his colleague and asked a simple question. Could they actually pull it off? The science behind the deception was both elegant and terrifying in its simplicity. Typhus fever, spread by lice in the overcrowded conditions of ghettos and concentration camps, was one of the most feared diseases of the war. It killed slowly, painfully, and spread with horrifying efficiency through any population living in close quarters without proper sanitation. The Germans had seen entire divisions weakened by typhus outbreaks on the Eastern Front, and the SS Medical Corps had standing orders to immediately quarantine any area showing signs of infection. The standard diagnostic test was called the Weil-Felix reaction, which detected antibodies in the blood that appeared during typhus infection. But here was the critical loophole that Dr. Kowalski had learned in medical school. Certain harmless bacteria, when injected into a patient, would trigger a false positive result on the Weil-Felix test. The patient would show no symptoms, suffer no illness, but their blood would scream typhus to any German doctor examining the results. Dr. Kowalski had access to a specific strain of Proteus bacteria that could create this exact reaction, and he realized he was holding the key to an invisible fortress. The preparation phase required absolute secrecy and meticulous planning. Dr. Nowak began cultivating the Proteus bacteria in his laboratory, creating enough supply to inoculate hundreds of people. They needed the fake epidemic to look real, which meant it had to spread in a pattern that matched actual disease transmission. They couldn't simply inject everyone at once. That would look suspicious. Instead, they created a careful timeline. Initial cases would appear in one village, then spread to neighboring communities over weeks and months, following the routes that people naturally traveled. Anna Wojcik became the coordinator, keeping detailed records of who had been injected, when they would need to be tested, and how to stagger the positive results to create a convincing epidemic curve. They recruited a network of trusted locals who understood the stakes and could keep the secret even under interrogation. Every person involved knew that if the deception was discovered, they would face execution, probably after torture designed to extract the names of everyone else in the conspiracy. The first test came in May of 1942, when Dr. Kowalski injected himself with the Proteus bacteria and waited 72 hours before drawing his own blood. He performed the Weil-Felix test in his clinic, his hands trembling slightly as he added the reagents, and watched for the reaction. The result was textbook perfect, a strong positive for typhus fever, despite the fact that he felt completely healthy. He showed the results to Dr. Nowak, and both men understood they had just weaponized medical science against the occupation. They began with volunteers from the resistance network, carefully selecting people who lived in different parts of the region and who could credibly present as the first victims of an outbreak. Within 2 weeks, they had created 20 positive cases, spread across 5 villages. Each patient was instructed to report mild symptoms to the German medical authorities if questioned: headache, fever, weakness. Nothing severe enough to require hospitalization, but consistent with early-stage typhus. The German response exceeded their most optimistic predictions. When the Occupation Health Office in the regional capital received reports of multiple typhus cases in the Rozwadów area, they immediately dispatched a medical team to investigate. The team consisted of 2 German army doctors and a Polish assistant who had been pressed into service. They arrived expecting to find a minor outbreak, perhaps a dozen cases that could be contained through isolation. Instead, they found positive viral Felix tests in patient after patient. Dr. Kowalski played his role perfectly, appearing exhausted and overwhelmed, showing them his records of new cases appearing daily, warning them that the infection was spreading faster than he could track. The German doctors examined the test results, interviewed patients who complained of exactly the right symptoms, and reached the only logical conclusion. Rozwadów was experiencing a major typhus epidemic. They filed an urgent report recommending immediate quarantine and withdrew to a safe distance, terrified of bringing the infection back to their own units. By June of 1942, the entire region surrounding Rozwadów had been declared a quarantine zone. The Germans posted signs warning of epidemic typhus, established checkpoints on all roads leading into the area, and issued orders forbidding SS patrols from entering, unless absolutely necessary. The irony was almost poetic. The same occupation force that was methodically exterminating millions of people suddenly refused to set foot in an area because they feared getting sick. The quarantine transformed the countryside into an accidental sanctuary. Jewish refugees continued to arrive, guided by resistance networks that now operated with unexpected freedom. The local population, no longer under constant surveillance, could shelter these refugees without the daily terror of random SS inspections. Dr. Kowalski and Dr. Nowak continued their medical theater, creating new positive cases whenever German authorities requested updated reports, maintaining the illusion of a persistent epidemic that never quite exploded into uncontrollable catastrophe, but never quite went away either. They had turned the Nazis' own fear against them, and thousands of lives now depended on keeping this elaborate lie alive. The quarantine zone became a strange mirror world where normal rules of occupation temporarily suspended. German patrols that had once rumbled through villages daily now stopped at the checkpoints marked with skull-and-crossbones warnings, their commanders unwilling to risk infection for routine inspections. The SS, so merciless in their pursuit of Jewish families everywhere else in Poland, suddenly treated this particular stretch of countryside as if it were radioactive. Supply convoys still passed through on the main roads, but the soldiers drove quickly with windows closed, refusing to stop or interact with locals. Administrative orders from the regional capital continued to arrive, demanding reports on the epidemic status, but no German official volunteered to verify the information in person. Dr. Kowalski submitted monthly updates detailing new cases, recoveries, and the persistent low-level spread of infection, each report carefully calibrated to maintain concern without triggering a more aggressive intervention. The Germans wanted the epidemic contained, not investigated, and this fundamental misunderstanding of their enemy's priorities became the refugees' greatest protection. Managing the deception required constant vigilance and increasingly complex logistics. Dr. Nowak's laboratory became a covert production facility, brewing batch after batch of the Proteus bacteria culture that created false positive results. They developed a rotation system where people who had tested positive months earlier would eventually test negative, simulating recovery, while new cases appeared to replace them. This created the appearance of a stubborn endemic disease rather than either a sudden explosive outbreak or a suspiciously stable situation. Anna Wojcik maintained 2 sets of medical records. The official documents shown to German authorities, filled with fabricated case numbers and treatment protocols, and a secret ledger tracking which refugees were hidden where and who among the local population had been inoculated with the harmless bacteria. The forgery extended beyond just blood tests. They created fake death certificates for typhus victims, complete with fabricated autopsies, to explain why some reported cases never appeared for follow-up testing. The bodies buried in those graves were actually refugees who had died from natural causes or Allied bombing raids, their deaths repurposed to strengthen the epidemic narrative. The human cost of maintaining the sanctuary went beyond deception and paperwork. The local Polish population endured genuine hardship as the quarantine isolated them from regional markets and outside support. Food became scarcer as supply chains broke down, with German authorities reluctant to send provisions into an infected zone. The community responded by sharing everything, rationing supplies so that hidden refugees received equal portions alongside long-time residents. Farmers concealed portions of their harvest from German requisitions, creating secret food caches distributed through networks coordinated by Father Laskowski. The priest transformed his church into a command center for the resistance effort, using confession booths for clandestine meetings and the bell tower as a lookout post to warn of unexpected German approaches. His sermons began incorporating coded messages about where new refugees could find shelter, which families needed additional supplies, and when German inspectors were scheduled to visit. The entire community became actors in an ongoing performance of normalcy, living ordinary lives on the surface while hiding an extraordinary secret just beneath. The refugee population, hidden within the quarantine zone, grew beyond anyone's initial expectations. By the autumn of 1942, Dr. Kowalski estimated they were sheltering nearly 3,000 people, with more arriving weekly through underground railroad networks that stretched back to the Warsaw Ghetto and beyond. These weren't just local families, they were refugees from across occupied Poland, people who had survived liquidations in Krakow, escaped from labor camps near Lublin, or fled massacres in dozens of smaller towns. They lived in conditions that tested human endurance, sleeping in haystacks during summer, huddled in root cellars during winter, eating whatever scraps could be spared, and spending weeks or months without seeing daylight. Children learned to remain absolutely silent during the day, when German convoys might pass nearby. Entire families lived in spaces barely large enough for one person. Yet they survived, because survival in hiding was infinitely preferable to the alternative that awaited them in the death camps. The psychological toll on the doctors orchestrating this deception was immense and unrelenting. Every time German medical authorities requested updated epidemic reports, Dr. Kowalski felt the weight of thousands of lives depending on his ability to maintain the lie. He lost weight, developed insomnia, and began showing genuine symptoms of stress that ironically made his performance as an overworked doctor fighting an epidemic more convincing. Dr. Nowak worried constantly about their bacteria cultures being discovered, knowing that a single surprise inspection of his laboratory would expose everything and trigger immediate retaliation. They lived with the knowledge that one mistake, one inconsistency in their fabricated data, one refugee discovered during a random patrol could unravel the entire operation and doom everyone involved. The paranoia was justified. Collaborators existed in every community. People willing to inform on their neighbors for extra food rations or simply out of fear. Yet somehow, across dozens of villages and involving hundreds of conspirators, the secret held. The epidemic that didn't exist continued to protect the thousands of people who did. The system of deception evolved into something far more sophisticated than anyone had initially imagined possible. Dr. Kowalski and Dr. Nowak realized early that maintaining a static epidemic would eventually raise suspicions, so they began introducing variations that mimicked the natural behavior of infectious disease. Some months showed higher case counts, others showed decline, creating the statistical noise that German epidemiologists would expect from real typhus transmission. They invented complications, secondary infections, treatment failures, relapses in previously recovered patients. Anna Wojcik became expert at fabricating patient histories that would satisfy any German inspector brave enough to actually review the files. She created elaborate backstories for fictional patients, complete with family medical histories, descriptions of living conditions that would facilitate lice transmission, and timelines of symptom progression copied from actual medical textbooks. The attention to detail was obsessive because it had to be. One implausible case history could trigger deeper investigation, and deeper investigation meant discovery, and discovery meant death for thousands. The refugees themselves had to become invisible, which required transforming the entire physical landscape of the quarantine zone. Barns were retrofitted with false walls, creating hidden compartments large enough to shelter families. Root cellars were expanded into underground networks, where people could hide during unexpected inspections. Forest camps were carefully positioned in areas with dense undergrowth, where aerial reconnaissance would reveal nothing. Local carpenters, working in secret, constructed concealed spaces in attics, beneath floorboards, and behind stoves that provided warmth during brutal Polish winters. Some hiding places were architectural marvels of ingenuity. Entire rooms accessible only through hidden panels, ventilation systems that prevented smoke from revealing occupation, soundproofing that muffled the cries of infants and children. The refugees learned to live like ghosts, leaving no trace of their presence. Laundry was done only at night. Cooking fires were lit sparingly, and only when cloud cover would disperse smoke. Human waste was buried far from dwellings. Every aspect of daily life was calibrated to prevent detection. Communication between the hidden populations and the outside resistance networks became increasingly critical and increasingly dangerous. Couriers moved through the quarantine zone carrying messages, forged documents, and occasionally smuggling people either into or out of the sanctuary, depending on circumstances. These couriers, often young women who attracted less German suspicion than men of military age, risked their lives on every journey. They memorized routes through forests and fields that avoided checkpoints, learned the schedules of German patrols, and developed cover stories explaining their travel through a quarantined epidemic zone. Some posed as nurses assisting Dr. Kowalski, carrying medical supplies that provided justification for movement. Others claimed family emergencies, visiting sick relatives whose typhus infections appeared in the fabricated medical records. The courier network brought vital intelligence from the outside world, warnings about planned SS operations in neighboring regions, news of Allied advances that offered hope, and heartbreaking reports about the fate of other Jewish communities that hadn't found sanctuary. They also carried requests for help from beyond the quarantine zone, pleas from desperate people seeking refuge, and information about the locations of other resistance cells. The moral calculus of who received shelter and who didn't haunted everyone involved in the operation. The harsh reality was that the sanctuary had limits. The local population could only provide so much food, create so many hiding places, and shoulder so much risk before the entire system collapsed. Father Laskowski and the community leaders faced impossible decisions weekly, sometimes daily. Families arrived exhausted after weeks of flight, and someone had to determine whether the community could absorb more refugees without jeopardizing everyone already hidden. They prioritized children, pregnant women, and the elderly, but that meant turning away young men who might have survived in the forests or able-bodied adults who could potentially find other options. Every rejection was a potential death sentence, and everyone involved understood that burden. Dr. Kowalski argued for accepting as many as physically possible, insisting that even brief sanctuary might save lives. Others, more pragmatic or more frightened, advocated for stricter limits, warning that overcrowding would lead to discovery and collective punishment. The debates were anguished and ongoing, conducted in whispers in church basements and darkened farmhouses, weighing lives against lives with no good answers. By the spring of 1943, the operation had achieved a precarious equilibrium. The German authorities had accepted the epidemic as a persistent reality, unfortunate but contained, requiring no dramatic intervention beyond maintaining the quarantine. Regular medical reports flowed from Dr. Kowalski to the Occupation Health Office, each one carefully crafted to maintain the status quo. The refugee population had stabilized at approximately 4,000 people, a number the community could support through the network of hiding places and food distribution. Births occurred in secret, attended by Anna Wojcik and midwives sworn to secrecy. Deaths were recorded as typhus casualties and buried in graves that would never reveal their true identities. Children grew up speaking only in whispers, playing silent games in attics and cellars, learning that survival meant invisibility. The adults maintained hope through small acts of resistance. secret schools where children learned to read, clandestine religious services conducted in multiple faiths, whispered stories about life before the war and dreams about liberation. The entire community, both the sheltering Poles and the hidden refugees, existed in a state of sustained tension, knowing that their survival depended on a medical lie and the continued fear of an enemy that could annihilate them all if they ever discovered the truth. The operation's greatest test came in the summer of 1943, when Berlin ordered a comprehensive review of all epidemic zones across occupied Poland. The directive originated from Heinrich Himmler's office, responding to reports that some quarantine areas might be exploited by resistance networks or used to conceal unauthorized populations. Regional SS commanders received instructions to verify the legitimacy of every reported typhus outbreak, using German medical personnel rather than relying solely on local doctors whose loyalty might be questionable. The order sent shockwaves through the resistance network when word reached Rozwadów. Dr. Kowalski understood immediately that this was the moment they had always feared. Actual German doctors, trained in Berlin, would arrive to conduct independent examinations. They would bring their own testing equipment, draw their own blood samples, and potentially discover that the epidemic was a fabrication. The entire operation, 2 years of meticulous deception sheltering thousands of lives, could unravel in a single afternoon if the inspection revealed the truth. The preparation for the German medical inspection became the most intensive period of the entire operation. Dr. Kowalski and Dr. Nowak realized they couldn't simply inject more people with Proteus bacteria and hope the German doctors would accept their existing test results. The inspectors would want to observe the testing process firsthand, from blood draw to final reading, eliminating any opportunity for substitution or manipulation. They needed a different approach, and they found it through a combination of medical knowledge and desperate improvisation. They identified approximately 30 people from the local population who were genuinely ill with other conditions, chronic infections, malnutrition-related illnesses, even cases of pneumonia. These patients showed real symptoms of sickness, fever, weakness, body aches that could plausibly be attributed to typhus in early stages. Dr. Kowalski coached each patient on what to say during examinations, teaching them to emphasize specific symptoms that aligned with typhus presentation. Meanwhile, they prepared a select group of previously injected individuals who would test positive on the viral Felix reaction, ensuring these patients were distributed across different villages to suggest widespread transmission rather than a localized cluster that might seem suspicious. When the German medical team arrived in late June of 1943, they brought an arrogance that Dr. Kowalski immediately recognized as potentially useful. The head inspector, a Dr. Heinrich Brandt from the University of Berlin medical faculty, made clear his belief that Polish doctors were incompetent and that most reported epidemics were probably exaggerations born from ignorance rather than actual disease. He announced his intention to personally examine every reported case, conduct fresh blood tests using proper German laboratory standards, and determine whether this supposed epidemic warranted continued quarantine or whether the area could be reopened for normal SS operations. His attitude was dismissive and condescending, exactly the kind of overconfidence that could be exploited. Dr. Kowalski played into this perfectly, appearing humble and slightly incompetent, agreeing enthusiastically with everything Dr. Brandt suggested and expressing relief that real German medical expertise would finally resolve the situation. He showed them to patients who were genuinely sick, whose fevers and symptoms were entirely real, even if their underlying conditions weren't typhus. He presented medical records with just enough small errors and inconsistencies to confirm Dr. Brandt's prejudices about Polish medical standards without raising suspicions about deliberate falsification. The critical moment came when Dr. Brandt insisted on conducting viral Felix tests himself, using reagents he had brought from Berlin. Dr. Kowalski had anticipated this and had carefully selected which patients would be tested. The German doctor drew blood samples from 12 patients across 3 villages, processed the tests in a makeshift laboratory he established in the local school, and waited for results. Dr. Kowalski watched, maintaining an expression of professional interest while his heart hammered against his ribs. Everything depended on the Proteus bacteria doing exactly what it was supposed to do: trigger the antibody reaction that would convince Dr. Brandt he was looking at genuine typhus cases. The wait felt eternal, hours stretching into geological time as the chemical reactions proceeded. When Dr. Brandt finally examined the results, his expression shifted from skepticism to concern. 8 of the 12 samples showed strong positive reactions. He repeated the tests twice more, obtaining identical results. The pattern of distribution, the clinical presentation of the sick patients, and now the laboratory confirmation all pointed to the same conclusion. The epidemic was real, persistent, and potentially dangerous. Dr. Brandt filed his report, recommending that the quarantine remain in full force, possibly be expanded, and that no unnecessary SS personnel should enter the zone without proper decontamination protocols. He departed Rozwadów within 3 days, visibly relieved to leave the infected area behind. His report, stamped with official German Medical Corps authority, became the gold standard reference that would protect the sanctuary for the remainder of the war. Regional SS commanders, who might have questioned the original Polish reports, now had confirmation from their own medical establishment. The Entwicklungsgebiet, the epidemic zone, was to be avoided except when absolutely necessary, and even then with maximum precautions. Dr. Kowalski read the German report when a copy arrived for his files, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to feel something approaching hope. They had passed the ultimate test. A German medical expert, trained in the finest institutions of the Reich, had examined their deception and concluded it was real. The invisible fortress would hold. The successful deception of Dr. Brandt transformed the operation from a desperate gamble into something approaching a sustainable system, but it also created new and unexpected challenges. Word spread through resistance networks across occupied Poland that the Rozwadów region offered genuine sanctuary, and the trickle of refugees became a flood that threatened to overwhelm the community's capacity. By the autumn of 1943, Dr. Kowalski estimated they were sheltering close to 5,000 people, nearly doubling the pre-war population of the entire area. The mathematics of survival became increasingly brutal. 5,000 additional people required food, water, medical care, and space in a region already stripped bare by German requisitions. The local farmers harvested their fields under German supervision, forced to surrender most of their crops to feed the occupation forces and the war effort. What little remained had to feed both the legitimate population and an equal number of invisible refugees whose existence could never be acknowledged. Hunger became constant, a grinding reality that weakened everyone and made even minor illnesses potentially fatal. The strain on the conspiracy's participants manifested in ways both predictable and heartbreaking. Anna Wojcik, who had maintained meticulous records and coordinated the complex logistics for nearly 2 years, began showing signs of complete exhaustion. She developed tremors in her hands that made drawing blood samples difficult, suffered from chronic insomnia that left her hollow-eyed and gaunt, and started making small errors in her documentation that could have proven catastrophic if discovered. Dr. Nowak's laboratory work became increasingly dangerous as the demand for Proteus cultures grew. He worked alone most nights, cultivating bacteria in glass containers that had to be hidden immediately if German inspectors arrived unexpectedly. The risk of contamination, either of himself or of the cultures, increased with every batch. Father Laskowski aged visibly under the burden of coordinating shelter for thousands while maintaining the appearance of normal parish duties. His sermons became shorter, his movements slower, and those closest to him noticed how his hands shook when he elevated the communion host during Mass. The psychological cost of holding so many lives in balance, of making daily decisions about who received shelter and who didn't, of living with constant fear of discovery, was grinding them all down to fragments of who they had been before the war. The refugees themselves existed in a state of suspended animation that tested the limits of human endurance. Many had been in hiding for over a year, some for nearly 2. They lived in darkness, often literally, spending weeks in cellars without natural light. Malnutrition was universal, children stopped growing, adults lost teeth and hair, and minor wounds refused to heal properly. Disease spread despite all precautions: dysentery, tuberculosis, and infections that would have been easily treatable before the war became death sentences in the overcrowded hiding places. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Dr. Kowalski that while they had fabricated a typhus epidemic to keep the Germans away, they were fighting real epidemics of other diseases among the hidden population. He treated infections with dwindling supplies of medication, set broken bones without proper equipment, and delivered babies in conditions that would have horrified any pre-war medical professional. Anna Wojcik assisted in surgeries performed by candlelight in barn lofts, using kitchen knives sterilized over open flames and vodka as the only anesthetic available. They saved some lives and lost others, each death a private tragedy that could never be properly mourned or acknowledged. The children growing up in hiding represented both the operation's greatest hope and its most vulnerable element. Dozens of babies had been born in the sanctuary, entering a world where their first breath had to be silent and their first years would be spent learning that making noise meant death. Mothers wrapped infants in blankets to muffle crying, sometimes too tightly, leading to suffocation that added to the already staggering emotional toll. Young children, naturally active and curious, had to be taught absolute stillness during daylight hours when German patrols might pass nearby. Some adapted with heartbreaking efficiency, becoming so quiet and withdrawn that they seemed to forget how to play. Others couldn't maintain the discipline, and their families faced impossible choices about whether they could remain in hiding or needed to be moved to more isolated forest camps where children's noise wouldn't endanger entire communities. Underground schools operated in whispers, teaching children to read and write and remember that life existed beyond hiding. Teachers, themselves refugees, conducted lessons in attics and cellars, using whatever scraps of paper could be found and teaching history, mathematics, and languages as acts of resistance against a regime that wanted to erase their students from existence entirely. By early 1944, as the war began turning against Germany on both the eastern and western fronts, new pressures emerged that threatened the sanctuary from unexpected directions. The Soviet Red Army was advancing westward across Ukraine and Belarus, and everyone understood that eventually the front lines would reach Poland. The prospect of liberation was tantalizing, but also terrifying, because the period of transition between German occupation and Soviet arrival would be chaotic and unpredictable. German forces retreating through Poland might decide to liquidate populations they considered hostile, or simply destroy everything in their path out of spite. The SS, facing defeat, might choose to murder hidden Jews rather than allow them to survive as witnesses to Nazi crimes. Dr. Kowalski and the resistance leaders began planning for multiple scenarios. What to do if the Germans discovered the deception before liberation arrived, how to protect the refugees during combat operations when the front line passed through the region, and how to handle potential Soviet suspicions about a quarantine zone that had remained mysteriously stable throughout the occupation. Every plan seemed inadequate, every scenario ended with possibilities for catastrophe, and yet they continued because stopping wasn't an option while people still needed sanctuary. The crisis that nearly destroyed everything came not from German discovery, but from an unexpected source that nobody had adequately prepared for: betrayal from within the community itself. In March of 1944, a Polish farmer named Tadeusz Grabowski, whose family had lived in the region for generations, approached the local German commandant with information about the supposed typhus epidemic. Grabowski had suffered personal losses during the war. His son had been conscripted for forced labor and died in a factory accident in Germany, and bitterness had curdled into something darker. He told the commandant that he suspected the epidemic was exaggerated or possibly fabricated, that he had seen healthy people who were supposedly sick with typhus working in fields at night, and that unusual numbers of strangers had been spotted in the forests around Rozwadów. He didn't explicitly mention Jews, perhaps out of residual decency, or perhaps because he didn't fully understand what he was reporting, but his information was enough to trigger exactly the kind of investigation that could unravel the entire operation. The commandant, a career officer named Hauptmann Klaus Zimmermann, had largely ignored the quarantine zone for 2 years, content to file reports and avoid the infected area. But a direct accusation from a local informant couldn't be dismissed without at least minimal investigation. The resistance network learned of Grabowski's betrayal within hours through a Polish secretary who worked in the German administrative office and routinely passed information to Father Laskowski. The warning gave them almost no time to prepare. Hauptmann Zimmermann had ordered a surprise inspection for the following morning, planning to bring a squad of soldiers to search specific farms that Grabowski had identified as suspicious. The locations included 3 properties currently sheltering over 200 refugees in concealed spaces. Dr. Kowalski convened an emergency meeting in the church basement at midnight, gathering the core conspirators to determine how to respond. The options were all terrible. They could attempt to relocate 200 people overnight, but moving that many refugees in darkness would be visible and noisy, potentially attracting exactly the attention they were trying to avoid. They could try to improve the hiding places, but the concealed spaces were already as sophisticated as they could be made with available materials. They could abandon the refugees, opening the hidden compartments and claiming ignorance, saving themselves while condemning hundreds to immediate execution. Or they could attempt one final desperate escalation of the deception that would either save everyone or doom them all. Dr. Kowalski proposed a plan so audacious that it left the others initially speechless. They would stage an acute typhus outbreak at the exact farms Hauptmann Zimmermann planned to inspect, creating such obvious and terrifying evidence of infectious disease that the German soldiers would refuse to conduct a thorough search. This meant finding volunteers willing to be injected with Proteus bacteria and then deliberately exhibit severe symptoms through a combination of acting and actual illness induced through other means. Dr. Nowak explained how they could use medications to induce genuine fever, cause visible rashes similar to those seen in typhus, and create the appearance of severe infection without actually making people dangerously ill. The volunteers would need to be convincing enough to terrify hardened German soldiers, perform their roles while genuinely suffering from induced symptoms, and maintain the deception even under direct German medical examination. Anna Wojcik immediately volunteered, as did Father Laskowski despite his age and deteriorating health. Others joined, understanding that this was likely the last chance to preserve the sanctuary. They had perhaps 8 hours to prepare a performance that would determine whether 5,000 people lived or died. The night became a blur of desperate preparation. Dr. Nowak prepared injections of Proteus bacteria, combined with substances that would induce fever and body aches within hours. Anna Wojcik applied makeup techniques she had learned from a former theater performer among the refugees, creating lesions and rashes that mimicked typhus symptoms with horrifying accuracy using beet juice, ash, and other improvised materials. The volunteers were positioned in the 3 targeted farms, placed in beds in the main houses, rather than hidden in concealed spaces, creating the appearance of a household overwhelmed by sudden, severe illness. Dr. Kowalski coached each person on how to present symptoms, the specific type of confusion seen in advanced typhus, the characteristic rash pattern, the alternating fever and chills. Meanwhile, other resistance members worked frantically in the hidden spaces beneath these same houses, ensuring that 200 refugees understood they needed to remain absolutely silent, regardless of what happened above them. Children were given mild sedatives to keep them quiet. Adults were positioned with hands over their own mouths, prepared to suffocate themselves rather than make noise that would reveal the hiding places. The entire operation balanced on a knife edge between salvation and catastrophe. When Hauptmann Zimmermann arrived at dawn with 12 soldiers, they found a scene that exceeded their worst nightmares about epidemic disease. The first farm they entered showed 3 people in various stages of what appeared to be severe typhus infection. Anna Wojcik lay in bed with genuine fever, induced by the medications, her skin covered in livid rashes, trembling and occasionally crying out in what seemed like delirium, but was actually carefully rehearsed performance. Father Laskowski, in another bed, exhibited the confusion and disorientation characteristic of typhus affecting the brain, muttering prayers and occasionally trying to rise before collapsing back. Dr. Kowalski moved between patients, his own exhaustion no longer requiring performance, genuinely overwhelmed and terrified in ways that made his portrayal absolutely convincing. He explained to Hauptmann Zimmermann that the epidemic had suddenly intensified, that these acute cases represented a new and more virulent phase, and that the situation was spiraling beyond his ability to control. He warned that everyone in the room was now exposed, that typhus could transmit through the air in enclosed spaces, and that they should evacuate immediately to avoid infection. The German soldiers, watching people writhe in beds covered with grotesque rashes, smelling the sickness real and performed that filled the farmhouse, began backing toward the door without waiting for orders. Hauptmann Zimmermann, his face pale, ordered an immediate withdrawal. They never searched the second or third farms. They never looked beneath the floorboards where 200 people held their breath in darkness. They fled the epidemic zone and never returned. The aftermath of Hauptmann Zimmermann's terrified retreat marked a turning point that transformed the sanctuary from a fragile deception into something approaching permanence. Within days of the inspection, new orders arrived from the regional SS headquarters mandating that the Rozwadów quarantine zone be expanded and reinforced with additional checkpoints positioned even farther from the core area. The orders explicitly forbid any German personnel from entering the zone, except in cases of absolute military necessity, and even then only with full protective equipment and decontamination protocols. Hauptmann Zimmermann's report had described conditions so alarming that his superiors decided the risk of epidemic spread outweighed any potential benefit from investigating the area further. The German military, facing increasingly desperate situations on both the eastern and western fronts by the spring of 1944, simply didn't have resources to waste on a disease-ridden backwater that offered no strategic value. The irony was almost unbearable. The Nazi regime, which had engineered the industrial murder of millions, was now too frightened of getting sick to investigate a region that harbored thousands of the very people they were trying to exterminate. The volunteers who had risked everything in the staged acute outbreak paid a significant physical price for their performance. Anna Wojcik's artificially induced fever had been more severe than Dr. Nowak intended, leaving her bedridden for nearly 2 weeks with genuine illness on top of the theatrical symptoms. Father Laskowski's already fragile health deteriorated further, the stress and physical demands of the performance accelerating the decline that overwork and malnutrition had begun. Several other volunteers developed infections from the injections or complications from the substances used to simulate symptoms, requiring medical treatment that depleted the community's already scarce supplies of antibiotics and medications. Yet none of them expressed regret. They had bought time, possibly years of time, for 5,000 people who would otherwise have been murdered. The cost of a few weeks of suffering seemed infinitely small compared to the alternative. Dr. Kowalski, watching Anna Wojcik slowly recover in a bed in his clinic, understood that they had crossed a threshold. The operation was no longer just about survival. It had become something else entirely, a sustained act of resistance that was saving lives on a scale that few other efforts in occupied Poland had achieved. As spring turned to summer in 1944, the military situation began shifting in ways that offered genuine hope for the first time since the occupation began. The Soviet Red Army launched massive offensives that shattered German defensive lines across Belarus and Ukraine, advancing westward with a speed that shocked even optimistic observers. Radio broadcasts, listened to secretly on hidden receivers, brought news of Allied landings in Normandy, of German armies retreating across France, of the Third Reich being crushed between advancing forces from east and west. The resistance networks began receiving updated intelligence suggesting that Soviet forces might reach eastern Poland within months rather than years. Liberation, which had seemed like a distant dream or possibly a fantasy, suddenly appeared on the horizon as a genuine possibility. Yet this hope came wrapped in new anxieties. The period between German retreat and Soviet arrival would be the most dangerous time when desperate SS units might decide to eliminate evidence of their crimes by massacring any Jews they could find. The refugees who had survived years in hiding might be murdered in the final weeks before freedom arrived. Dr. Kowalski and the resistance leadership began preparing for endgame scenarios that required completely different strategies than the deception that had sustained them for 2 years. They established evacuation routes into the deepest forests, places where the entire refugee population could disperse if German forces decided to sweep the region before retreating. They created buried caches of food and supplies that could sustain people for weeks if they had to flee the established hiding places. They coordinated with partisan groups operating in the forests, establishing protocols for armed resistance if the Germans attempted a final liquidation action. The fake Typhus epidemic, which had been their shield, might become irrelevant if retreating German forces simply decided to burn every village in their path, regardless of disease concerns. Anna Wojcik, recovered from her illness, began training selected refugees in basic first aid and survival skills, preparing them for the possibility that they might need to survive without the organized support network that had sustained them. The entire community understood they were entering the most dangerous phase of the war, the desperate endgame when anything could happen and years of careful survival could be destroyed in a single chaotic afternoon. The emotional landscape of the sanctuary shifted as liberation became imaginable. People who had survived by suppressing hope, by focusing only on the immediate moment and the next day's survival, began allowing themselves to dream about futures beyond hiding. Families discussed what they would do after the war, where they might go, how they would rebuild lives from the ruins. Young people who had spent their adolescence in cellars and attics imagined what normal life might feel like, going to school openly, walking in daylight without fear, sleeping without listening for the sound of German vehicles. Parents dared to hope their children might grow up in a world without constant terror. Yet the hope was fragile and bittersweet, tempered by the knowledge of how many had already died, how many families had been destroyed, how many communities had been erased. The refugees in Rozwadów represented a tiny fraction of Poland's Jewish population, most of whom had already been murdered in the death camps. They were survivors, but they were also witnesses to an almost complete catastrophe. Dr. Kowalski, watching hope and grief war in people's faces, understood that even if liberation came, even if everyone survived, the scars from these years would never fully heal. The invisible wounds would persist long after the physical hiding places were no longer necessary, marking everyone who had lived through this sustained nightmare of deception, fear, and desperate resistance against an enemy that had seemed invincible, but was finally beginning to crumble. Liberation came not as a single triumphant moment, but as a chaotic, terrifying, and almost anticlimactic process that stretched across late July and early August of 1944. The Soviet Red Army's advance reached the region in a series of artillery barrages that announced their arrival hours before the first tanks appeared on the roads leading into Rozwadów. The German forces, already depleted and demoralized, retreated westward with minimal resistance, more concerned with escape than with holding territory that had become strategically meaningless. For 3 days, the area existed in a bizarre limbo between occupation and liberation, with German units pulling back along the main roads while Soviet reconnaissance patrols probed forward through the forests and fields. During this transition, Dr. Kowalski and the resistance leadership faced their final crisis: whether to keep the refugees hidden until the situation stabilized, or to allow them to emerge and risk being caught in combat between retreating Germans and advancing Soviets. They chose caution, keeping everyone concealed while Father Laskowski made contact with Soviet officers to explain the situation and negotiate safe conditions for emergence. The wait was agonizing, hours that felt like years as artillery fire echoed in the distance and tank engines rumbled along nearby roads, knowing that freedom was so close, but that one stray shell or one final German atrocity could still destroy everything. When the refugees finally emerged from hiding, the scenes were almost indescribable in their emotional intensity. People who had lived in darkness for months or years stumbled into daylight, blinking against the sun like newborns, their bodies emaciated and weakened, but their spirits beginning to comprehend that they had survived. Children who had learned to live in silence began cautiously making noise, their voices tentative at first, then gradually growing stronger as they realized that making sound would no longer bring death. Families reunited with other families they hadn't seen since going into separate hiding places, discovering who had survived and learning who had died during the long concealment. The Soviet soldiers who witnessed these emergencies were hardened combat veterans who had seen horrific things across thousands of kilometers of brutal warfare, yet many were visibly shocked by the condition of the refugees and moved by the realization of what the local Polish community had accomplished. The Soviet military authorities, initially suspicious of the typhus quarantine, quickly understood the deception when Dr. Kowalski explained the operation and showed them the Proteus bacteria cultures that had made it possible. Some officers were impressed by the ingenuity, others were skeptical that such a scheme could have worked, but all agreed that the result spoke for itself. 5,000 people who should have been dead were instead alive. The immediate aftermath brought its own brutal challenges that tested survivors who had already endured years of hardship. The local infrastructure had collapsed during the occupation and the fighting. Food supplies were critically low. Medical care was nearly non-existent beyond what Dr. Kowalski and Anna Wojcik could provide with their exhausted resources. Many refugees were severely ill from years of malnutrition and living in unsanitary conditions, requiring treatment that simply wasn't available in the immediate post-liberation chaos. Typhoid, tuberculosis, and other diseases that the fabricated epidemic had supposedly represented now appeared as genuine threats among a population whose immune systems had been compromised by years of deprivation. Deaths continued even after liberation, people who had survived the Germans succumbing to diseases and malnutrition in the weeks after freedom arrived. The Soviet authorities established temporary camps to house the refugees, while trying to determine what to do with thousands of displaced people in a region that had been devastated by war. Some refugees chose to leave immediately, seeking relatives in other parts of Poland, or hoping to emigrate to Palestine or America. Others remained, too exhausted or too traumatized to make immediate decisions about their futures, simply grateful to be alive and struggling to process everything they had experienced. Dr. Kowalski, Anna Wojcik, and the other key conspirators found themselves in a strange position after liberation, simultaneously celebrated and forgotten. The Soviet authorities recognized their resistance efforts and documented the operation for military intelligence purposes, understanding that the deception had kept German forces away from a strategically useful area. Some Polish resistance organizations honored them as heroes who had saved thousands of lives through courage and ingenuity. But in the immediate chaos of post-war Poland, with millions dead and entire cities destroyed, their story was just one among countless acts of resistance and survival. Dr. Kowalski returned to his medical practice, now treating the very people he had protected, dealing with the physical and psychological aftermath of years in hiding. Anna Wojcik continued her nursing work, helping refugees transition to whatever came next, providing medical care and emotional support to people struggling with trauma that had no easy remedy. Father Laskowski, his health permanently damaged by the years of stress and deprivation, continued his pastoral duties, conducting funeral masses for those who had died after liberation and wedding ceremonies for young couples who had fallen in love in hiding and now wanted to formalize their relationships in freedom. The final accounting of the operation revealed both its extraordinary success and its inevitable limitations. Of the approximately 5,000 Jewish refugees who found shelter in the Rozwadów quarantine zone between 1942 and 1944, roughly 4,200 survived to see liberation. The deaths during the hiding period resulted from disease, malnutrition, complications during childbirth, and a handful of cases where refugees were discovered during movement between hiding places and executed by German patrols. The survival rate was remarkable compared to the near-total extermination that occurred in most of occupied Poland, where entire Jewish communities were annihilated in the death camps. Yet Dr. Kowalski never spoke of the operation as an unqualified success. He thought constantly about the refugees they had been forced to turn away due to capacity limitations, about the impossible decisions regarding who received shelter when resources were scarce, about the children who had died from preventable diseases because proper medical care wasn't available in hiding. The weight of those losses never fully lifted, even as he understood that the alternative would have been infinitely worse. The fake epidemic had saved thousands, but it couldn't save everyone, and that fundamental limitation haunted everyone who had participated in the deception, a reminder that even the most successful resistance could only mitigate rather than prevent the catastrophe that the Nazi occupation had represented. The story of Rozwadów and its phantom epidemic disappeared into the chaos of post-war Europe with an almost deliberate silence that lasted for decades. Dr. Stefan Kowalski and Dr. Marek Nowak never sought recognition for what they had accomplished, viewing their actions as simple moral obligations rather than heroism worthy of celebration. Anna Wojcik emigrated to Israel in 1948, carrying with her the memories of those years but rarely speaking about them, even to her own children. Father Laskowski died in 1951, his health never recovering from the sustained stress and deprivation of the occupation years. The survivors scattered across the world, rebuilding lives in places far from the forests and cellars where they had hidden, and many chose not to speak about their experiences, wanting to move forward rather than dwell on trauma. The operation existed primarily in fragmentary testimonies and Soviet military intelligence reports that weren't declassified for years. It wasn't until the 1980s and 90s when historians began systematically documenting lesser-known resistance efforts during the Holocaust that the full scope of what happened in Rozwadów began to emerge. Even then, the story remained obscure, compared to more famous acts of resistance known primarily to specialists rather than entering the broader historical consciousness that everyone should share. What makes this story so profoundly important isn't just the ingenuity of the medical deception, though that aspect is remarkable enough on its own. It's what the operation reveals about the capacity for ordinary people to resist totalitarian evil through sustained collective action and moral courage. Dr. Kowalski wasn't a trained spy or a professional resistance fighter. He was a country doctor who understood basic immunology and had the courage to weaponize that knowledge against an enemy that seemed invincible. The Polish farmers, craftsmen, and townspeople who sheltered refugees weren't professional conspirators. They were ordinary individuals who chose to risk everything because turning away desperate people violated something fundamental in their sense of human decency. This wasn't dramatic resistance involving sabotage or armed combat. It was the quiet, grinding daily courage of maintaining a lie for 2 years while living under constant threat of discovery and execution. It was the moral choice to share scarce food with people who had no claim except their humanity. It was the collective decision that some things mattered more than survival, that preserving life and dignity in the face of systematic extermination was worth risking everything. The question that haunts this story, the question that should haunt anyone who learns about it, is both simple and devastating. What would you have done? It's easy to imagine ourselves as heroes when reading history from the safety of distance and hindsight. It's far more difficult to honestly confront whether we would have the courage to make the choices these people made. Would you shelter refugees knowing that discovery meant death, not just for you but for your entire family? Would you lie to the faces of armed occupiers who could execute you on suspicion alone? Would you share your children's food with strangers when your own family was starving? Would you maintain a dangerous deception for months and years, living with constant fear and the knowledge that one mistake could doom thousands? These aren't abstract questions. They're the moral reality that the people of Rozwadów faced every single day for 2 years. They chose courage over safety, community over individual survival, and human decency over collaboration with evil. Their choices saved 5,000 lives that the Nazi regime had marked for extermination. The legacy of this operation extends far beyond the specific individuals who survived. It stands as proof that resistance was possible even under the most totalitarian conditions, that ordinary people possessed agency even when facing industrialized genocide, and that moral courage could achieve results that seemed impossible. The story challenges the narrative that resistance was futile, that collaboration was the only realistic option, or that individuals were powerless against the machinery of the Holocaust. Dr. Kowalski and his conspirators demonstrated that even without weapons or military training, people could fight back using intelligence, deception, and collective solidarity. They turned the Nazis' own fear against them, exploiting the gap between the regime's image of invincibility and its actual vulnerability to things it couldn't control, like epidemic disease. The operation also reveals something crucial about how resistance works. It required an entire community, not isolated heroes. It needed doctors and priests and nurses and farmers and carpenters and couriers all working together, each contributing what they could, creating a network of mutual support that was stronger than any individual could be alone. This story deserves to be remembered not as a comfortable tale of good triumphing over evil, but as a complex, difficult, and ultimately inspiring account of what ordinary people can accomplish when they refuse to accept the unacceptable. The people of Rozwadów didn't stop the Holocaust. They couldn't prevent the murder of millions or halt the machinery of genocide. What they did was save 5,000 specific human beings who had names and families and futures that would have been erased if not for this sustained act of deception and courage. Every one of those survivors carried forward lives that produced children and grandchildren, creating entire family trees that exist today, because a country doctor understood immunology and a community chose solidarity over safety. When we ask what individual action matters in the face of systematic evil, this is the answer. It matters to the specific people you save, to the lives you preserve, to the futures you make possible. The fake epidemic of Rozwadów stands as a monument to the power of moral courage, creative resistance, and the stubborn human refusal to accept that evil is inevitable or that ordinary people are powerless. These people proved otherwise, and their story demands that we remember not just what they did, but what it cost them, what it reveals about human nature at its best, and what it challenges us to consider about our own capacity for courage when confronted with injustice. What would you have done? That question isn't just about history. It's about who you are right now and who you would choose to be if tested the way they were tested. Their answer was clear. What's yours?